So originally I wanted the topic C.S. Lewis and the Case for Christianity. And of course, Dr. Rosenblatt has seniority, so he got that topic. Then they did me the good, they gave me the good assignment, the Abolition of Man, which is actually the worst assignment because it's the most depressing of all of C.S. Lewis's philosophical, theological works. Can you all hear me well? I feel like, okay, it sounds weird up here. We're going to talk about the abolition of man, and in particular, C.S. Lewis's critique of what he calls new or modern education. This is not going to be a talk on C.S. Lewis's overall vision for education. There are, plenty of, we could do that, but it's kind of boring. It's reading lists and curricula and things like that. If you're interested in that, if you're an educator and you want to know what C.S. Lewis's overall picture of education looks like, there's a great book by a man named Joel Heck. The title is Irrigating Deserts, and there's a subtitle too. I just don't remember what it is. CPH, I believe, published that book some time ago. Show of hands real quick, though. Who's read The Abolition of Man? Okay. In the last year? Okay. Of course, Sam Schulteis has. So I'm kind of guessing that I probably could say a whole lot of things about it and speak with confidence and convince you it's true even if it might not be. The Abolition of Man is I think, and I'm not the smartest person, I'm not the dumbest person, I'm somewhere in the middle, I think maybe low middle. It's a hard book. It's sort of like having a big, it's a short book, but it's like having a big puzzle, and every time you think you've put the pieces together, you go back and read it again and go say, well, that actually doesn't quite capture the spirit of the book. It's a book you could read probably every year for the rest of your life and still learn new things or chase or go down rabbit holes you didn't go down before. Lewis refers to all sorts of authors, ancient and modern and Eastern and Western, from Aristotle, Plato, the Greeks generally, to the Rig Veda and the Hindu tradition. He starts the book, in fact, with a quotation from Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, in an epigraph that kind of sets the tone and tenor of the book. Another reason that's makes me a little uncomfortable doing the book or talking about the book is that Lewis purposely writes the book from not a non-Christian perspective, but a perspective that he hopes will draw in the most amount of people. He says right in the middle of the book, I myself am a theist and indeed a Christian, but I'm not here attempting any indirect argument for Christianity or even theism, just general belief in God. I am simply arguing that if we are to have values at all in our culture, we must accept the ultimate platitudes of practical reason as having absolute validity, which is kind of an odd end to that sentence. But he's writing a book, or he wrote a book, not to persuade anybody of the truthfulness of Christianity or not to make an argument for God's existence like he does in the first 4 or 5 chapters of Mere Christianity. Rather, he's arguing, if you remember from the book, those of you who have read it, he's arguing that the direction or the trajectory of modern education, in particular the philosophical underpinnings of modern education, are going to lead, quite frankly, though he doesn't use this particular phrase, cultural or civilizational collapse. Some of the things he says in this book are quite drastic. For example, or we say hyperbolic. Let me go back here. He says the difference between the old approach to education and the new one is an important one. The old initiated the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as poultry keepers deal with young birds, making them thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men or women transmitting womanhood to women. The new is merely propaganda. And I remember reading this line, thinking, having taught in higher ed for 20 years, no longer, I mean a little bit part-time, but in many ways I'm kind of a recovering college professor. I never want to go back, though I keep, as Keith always makes fun of me for, I always do. My wife does too. She makes fun of me for saying yes to teaching, of course. But it reminded me of something a contemporary, he died maybe a few years, maybe 10 years ago now, a contemporary thinker said about education, essentially affirming what C.S. Lewis said would happen if the trajectory in the mid-20th century in Britain persisted. The contemporary philosopher is a man named Richard Rorty. In a book, he's like one of these postmodern philosophers. In a book that he wrote towards the end of his academic career, where it was sort of set up or commissioned where he would address all his critics. The book is simply called Rorty and His Critics. He wrote an essay in there called titled Truth and Universality, where he talks about education in the modern world and actually in glowing terms of where education is at. And here's what he says. Let me find the right place to start here. Conservative Christian parents of my students think that the entire American liberal establishment is engaged in a conspiracy. And they have a point. Their point is that we liberal teachers, we might substitute liberal for progressivist teachers, no more feel like we have to be respectful or deferential when we talk with bigots than do kindergarten teachers talking with their students. When we American college teachers encounter religious fundamentalists, we do not consider the possibility of reformulating our own practice so as to give more weight to the authority of the Christian scriptures. Instead, we do our best to convince these students of the benefits of secularization. We assign first-person accounts of growing up homosexual to our homophobic students for the same reasons that German school teachers in the post-war period assigned the diary of Anne Frank. The racist or fundamentalist parents of our students, that would be that's something I added to the text. The racist or fundamentalist parents of our students say that in a truly democratic society, the students should not be forced to read books by such people, black people, Jewish people, homosexual people. They will protest that these books are being jammed down their children's throats. I cannot see, this is Rorty, how to reply to this charge without saying something like, there are credentials for admission to our democratic society. The society we are building, or as in Lewis's language, conditioning, these credentials which we liberals have been making are increasingly stringent. We do our best to excommunicate racists, male chauvinists, homophobes, and the like. You have to be educated in order to be a citizen of our society, to participate in our conversation. Someone with whom we can envision merging our horizons. So we're going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. We are not so inclusivist as to tolerate intolerance such as yours. He seems nice. He goes on. Towards the end of this section on modern education, he says, I have no trouble offering this reply to people like you, since I do not claim to make the distinction between education and conversation on the basis of anything except my loyalty to a particular community, a community whose interests require re-educating, required re-educating the Hitler Youth in 1945, and required re-educating the bigoted students of Virginia in 1993. I don't see anything neutral about my handling of my fundamentalist students. Rather, I think those students are lucky to find themselves under the benevolent authority of people like me, and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous, and I'm going to add in here, religious parents. It seems to me that I'm just as provincial and contextualist as the Nazi teachers who made their students read Der Stürmer. The only difference is that I serve a better cause. I come from a better province. That's Richard Rorty, probably, I mean, if there was like a who's who in the the so-called intellectual zoo, and it is a zoo, in the late 20th, early 21st century, he would loom large on the top of like the leading figures on that list. And that the problem with modern education and that attitude in modern education, that the secularist trend and assumptions behind modern education, which are really just atheist trends, was envisioned already by C.S. Lewis. And in the Abolition of Man, essentially what the work does, especially when you get to the third and last chapter, is kind of like, I think it was Russell Kirk or William Buckley who says, he acts like it's Lewis acting as a conservative, standing athwart history and saying, slow down, stop. If we keep doing things the way we're doing, we're going to have a culture or a civilization where we will have students who will have all sorts of technology at their fingertips, but won't have the wisdom to use it correctly or morally. Now, I said a bit ago, and I should have done this maybe earlier, that The Abolition of Man is one of C.S. Lewis's most difficult books. Despite that, you should read it. It's remarkable. A few things, though, in terms of reading it, maybe I borrow a line from Chad Bird. If you're having a tough time, maybe don't read it right now, because it's very difficult. It will take up a lot of time. You're probably going to need to get a commentary to make sense of all the classical references. In the spirit of Dr. Rosenblatt, a bibliographical reference that would be very helpful if you plan on reading the text is Michael Ward's book, After Humanity, which literally dissects the book line by line, but also gives you all sorts of historical details. What you'll see in the book is essentially a master's, C.S. Lewis, getting to the heart and soul of the problem behind education, or behind modern education. That is, education has been informed, increasingly so over the last century, maybe longer, by a worldview that is ultimately hostile to any sort of religious and certainly a Christian worldview. This is not an argument to go home and rip your kids out of public school. If they're at a good public school, that's all well and good. But be very careful with what schools you send your kids to or what schools you recommend, because as my wife and I found out very recently, in our town, which is supposed to be a very conservative town, the town of Wheaton, the home of evangelicalism and Wesleyanism and so on and so forth, it's as loony as any of the schools you hear about on Fox News. Maybe not quite that loony, but pretty close. When you got furries urinating in boxes in the bathroom and the whole pronoun craze sort of becoming normative, and you've got a problem. Anyway, Abolition of Man, just to kind of pull back a little bit, one of the reasons why it's so complicated to read is Lewis is not writing for children. He's not even writing for what Dr. Rosenblatt called last night the rest of us. He wrote the book for academics. February 24th, 1943, he boards a train with his brother Warnie. I imagine they both had tweeds on, they're smoking cigarettes, drinking sherry, and they head off northeastward of Oxford. And if you're from Oxford, you say you're heading down, because everything's down, including Cambridge from Oxford. That's a joke. It's okay to laugh. Goes over to the University of Durham, to a college there called King's College, which is now part of the University of Newcastle. Dr. Van Voris, who's doing a breakout right now, he and I once had a rip-roaring good time at the University of Newcastle when we attended a academic conference, but the things we did there will forever remain under lock and key. But he goes there, and he was invited to offer a lecture for 3 evenings in a row under what's called the Riddle Memorial Lecture Series. And these were lectures that were established by a very wealthy patron to bring in a leading figure in the British higher education establishment to address topics of religion and popular or religion and society in generally. I think Lewis's lectures were the 15th. It was 15 years at that point that the lectures had been put in place. It's still going on today. I think one of the more recent lecture series, the title was something like Good News in an Age of Fake News or something like that. They're all they seem very practical and realistic, but they're always done by like the heavy-hitting academics of the age. So Lewis goes there, and when he gives these lectures, he's not giving them to 18-year-old undergrads. They're certainly invited. Primarily, these lectures are for faculties of universities. So Lewis is he's not translating anything for the rest of us. He's writing for academics who are going to get all these references, hence why the rest of us need things like commentaries to understand it. He does the lectures for 3 days. After the lecture series, in one of his letters, he says he thinks that the lectures went all right, but he doesn't think the book these lectures are eventually going to be turned into is going to reach much of an audience. He was pretty convinced that mostly the book would be read just by stuffy tweed-wearing academics. As it turns out, Abolition of Man routinely makes oftentimes the top 10 books to read list that are published by groups like National Review, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and more conservative-leaning think tanks. But even more interesting, not too long ago, I want to say 3 years ago, the Abolition of Man was quoted on the floor of Congress. So while Lewis didn't think it would have much of an impact, it is, even to this day, and I remember 2 years ago after Michael Ward's book, After Humanity, came out, it was the book everybody was talking about. And in fact, our church has a reading group where we spent, I don't know, it must have been 5 weeks talking about the Abolition of Man. There's a lecture series on some podcast, not the 1517 podcast network, but a podcast network elsewhere, where the speaker or the person doing the podcast talks for 12 hours on this one, 70, 80-page book. It is profound. Anyway, so what's the argument C.S. Lewis puts forward? There's a lot of ways we could describe this. In short, though, I think the way Lewis responds to Dorothy Sayers kind of gives us a little clue at ultimately what he's doing in this book. Dorothy Sayers, all know the name. She wrote the book, The Lost Tools of Learning, The Mind of the Maker, and other great books. She asked Lewis if he wrote his lectures and published the book, The Abolition of Man, in view of a man named I.A. Richards, who was from Cambridge, a literary professor, or professor of literature, but also one of the chief advocates for a philosophy that was quite popular and still is very popular. In fact, it might be the philosophy of our day and age, simply called Subjectivism. And interestingly, Lewis was kind of friendly with I.A. Richards. He disagreed vehemently with his philosophy, but was friendly enough to invite him to Magdalen College in Oxford one year to give lectures, and then realized that Dr. Richards was going to stay overnight, but Lewis had, being the absent-minded professor, failed to secure any sort of lodging for him that night. So he scrambles after the lectures series and says, I got to get you some rooms. And he goes, I think R.G. Collingwood, another very famous historian from Magdalen College, I think he's gone. You can use his rooms. So Lewis brings Dr. Richards to Collingwood's rooms there and says, you can sleep here. And Richards says, well, there's no books here. I have to read before I go to bed. So Lewis says, I've got a solution. So he goes back to his rooms, grabs Dr. Richards' book on literature, and says, here, this will put you to sleep. And it gets better, though. And allegedly, I don't know if this is from a diary or just academic legend, but allegedly Dr. Richards started thumbing through the book just to see if Lewis wrote notes, and the notes were so nasty that he couldn't even sleep that night, because he didn't like that C.S. Lewis didn't have a high opinion of his philosophy. What is subjectivism? We all kind of have a sense of it, but in a mid-20th century context, it's a little more complicated than the sort of subjectivism you see on the streets in modern-day America. Mid-20th century in England, English universities, and certainly it trickled out of those universities into the popular culture to some extent or another. Now, 1943, probably not so much because everybody's hiding out in subways and things just trying to survive. But in the mid-20th century, the philosophy known as logical positivism had run its course in English-speaking universities, in the British Isles as well as many places in the United States. Like all philosophies, logical positivism isn't all bad, but there's a whole lot of stuff that's troubling, especially for Christians or anybody who believes there's something higher than just material reality. The logical positivists, two big names associated with that school would be like A.J. Ayer. There's a great story about A.J. Ayer confronting Mike Tyson when he's hitting on Naomi Campbell, like in 1987, when he's a 70-year-old man. Mike Tyson, the boxer who bites ears and things. I guess he was hitting on Naomi Campbell at a party in New York City, and A.J. Ayer, who's maybe my height, I don't know, on 140 pounds soaking wet, kind of gets in the middle because he can sense Naomi Campbell, who's a model. I don't even know what she looks like, but a model I read on Wikipedia. A.J. Ayer gets in the middle to help give Naomi Campbell some space and says, "Why don't you leave the lady alone?" And Mike Tyson, I guess, was 21 at the time. He says, "Do you know who the blank I am? I'm Mike Tyson, the heavyweight champion of the world." And A.J. Ayer says, and a 70-year-old man goes, "Well, do you know who I am? I'm the former Wickham professor of logic at Oxford University." Apparently that gave Naomi some space and she left. Anyway, A.J. Ayer and Ludwig Wittgenstein would be sort of representatives of that logical positivist tradition. And there's a lot we could say about it, but in short, logical positivism had reduced claims of theology, religion, worldview, ethics, aesthetics, every sort of claim that is other than an assertion about the state of the world to a category of mere meaninglessness. The way Ayer put it in his famous book, which A.J. Ayer and C.S. Lewis knew each other and even debated each other. I think C.S. Lewis described Ayer as somewhere between a rodent and a firefly. But Ayer said that there are things like 2 + 2 is 4, or all bachelors are unmarried males that we know that are for certain, but you don't even need to investigate that stuff because you just know it. It's a tautology. It's self-evident. There are other claims we make about the world that you can know with a high degree of probability insofar as it corresponded to the world, and the way you would do that is verify if something's true or not. But then there are statements we make. These are the statements of metaphysics, perhaps even history. Wittgenstein would add aesthetics and value that are claims we shouldn't make in the first place. We should pass over such claims in silence because all they are, and here's where subjectivism comes in. This is what Dr. Richard adds to this the discussion, is anytime we make an assertion about valuing something, like the example Lewis will use in Abolition of Man is calling a waterfall sublime, are simply an expression of our emotions. There's nothing real, factual, truthful about them. And what Lewis detects, when he's invited to do these Riddle lectures, he chooses, for whatever reason, as the subtitle puts it, so it's the title of the lecture series is Abolition of Man. The subtitle is Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools, basically 8th through 12th grade education. And a book was sent to him to review that he calls the Green Book. It's actually a book called The Control of Language by 2 Australian scholars who are actually Oxford students. And part of me thinks maybe Lewis chose this book because he knew they should have known better, because they were classic scholars and probably had Lewis as a professor. But he calls it the Green Book because he doesn't want to critique them too hard. They're early on in their academic career. Picks on a few other books that he makes references to, and he detects, even in books on the English language that are trying to teach 8th through 12th graders how to write well, he detects that underneath it is this philosophy of subjectivism, that all expressions of value is just sort of a biochemical response to your perception of the world outside of your head, and that's it. And I mean, that's not to say like makes you wonder what they'd think about theological assertions. This is just things like waterfall sublime, or helping a little old person, because I don't want to use gendered language, across the street is good, or something like that, are just simply emotional reactions to things, emotional responses. Lewis argues, in short, over the course of dozens and dozens of pages, if this philosophy takes hold and trickles out of the university and starts to inform, universally, the education system, we will have a culture full of people without chests. That's the first chapter of the book, men without chests. That is, he's using the old medieval analogy that a person is comprised essentially of three things. They've got their head, the rational part of them. They got their lower part, their belly and below, that's their instinctual part. Their torso, their trunk, their chest is sort of what helps a person mediate between the rationality and their instinctual desires. So the philosophy of subjectivism removes all of that, and it reduces people to mere animals, or perhaps angelic beings, pure rational beings who are disconnected from reality. The second chapter, and this is the one that Dr. Montgomery critiqued yesterday, or I guess it was Thursday now, is entitled The Tao. And it's essentially a chapter where Lewis argues, though he doesn't use the term natural law, he does say law of nature. He argues that the implied argument is that the way to kind of get back on course away from this subjectivism is to revisit or rekindle this sense that there's a natural law that he calls the Tao. Now, why does he use the word Tao? That's a Chinese word. It's prominent in Confucian philosophy and Taoist philosophy, obviously Taoist philosophy. Lewis argues, he doesn't quote, but certainly inspired by Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, that all people across the world, regardless of the way they look or the traditions they were raised in, have a sense that there is a right. And in the second chapter, he argues the way to combat against rampant subjectivism and civilizational collapse is to restore or to teach from within the Tao, is the phrase he'll use over and over again, to restore that natural law tradition. Now, Dr. Montgomery was right on Thursday. The natural law tradition doesn't give you specifics. It's hazy and not all that helpful when it comes down to particular things. But in defense of Lewis, because he's speaking to a very secular public audience, because he's trying to keep his audience captivated, knowing full well in a Britain at the time that is not atheist in its confession or something like that, but is certainly informed by a practical atheism, the only way to hang on to them is to refer to something other than just what he may have called Christian parochial concern. So that's why he appeals to this universal natural law tradition, if you will. The third and final chapter, Lewis considers what would happen if the natural law tradition, or just tradition generally across the globe, was abandoned completely. The last chapter is called Abolition of Man, and here's how he puts it towards the end. If I can find it. I put my daughter, thankfully, had these little stickies, and I've got too many of them to find the one handily. He says, this is page 59, if you want the page reference. He says, the final stage in this as we work away from the Tao, or this natural law tradition, and there's other names for it, we arrive at this final stage when man, by eugenics or by prenatal conditioning and by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall have taken the thread of life out of the hand of Clotho. Clotho being one of these Greek muses, who the picture of her is that she was the one who kind of predetermined things. She held the strings like a puppeteer, I guess. So the thread will be taken out of the hand of Clotho, and be henceforth free. We will be free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle will indeed be won, but who precisely will have won it? And he goes on in the very ending of the book is extremely dark. He argues in that last chapter that while this subjectivism might appeal to the masses because it seems to imply that everybody's free to kind of do as they wish, he argues there's only going to be a select few, though, who ultimately really are going to benefit from all this. And he says, so in the end, totalitarianism isn't just going to be in Germany. Totalitarianism will emerge in democratic societies, and certainly it's in fascist societies and so on. And ultimately, though he doesn't argue this specifically, the end of the book, it's like he says, the only real the differences between totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism, and democracy, and he adds a few others in there, he goes, is not the differences of political parties. They all can essentially work the same. They can all be horror shows. The thing that keeps a society from becoming a horror show is if there's something higher that governs things below. And for him, though it's not the strongest, it's not a Christian argument at all, or at least only a little bit, the only thing that will preserve a society from running amok, preserve society from totalitarian control, whether it's a fascist state or a democratic state, is a restoration of this old natural law tradition. Now, Dr. Montgomery on Thursday rightfully critiqued this, especially in light of there's a renewed emphasis in our day and age on this natural law tradition, especially from like the trad Catholics and other religious traditions. And that's all well and good. But as my friend Scott Keith reminds me, I have these moments of darkness. It's like every other day. Like Monday, I'm a happy libertarian. Tuesday, I'm like leaning towards Christian nationalism, blasphemy laws, and Scott seems to think it's any time I'm watching the news and I'm hearing about all this trans agenda and stuff, that's when I turn Christian nationalist. But then Scott comes to the rescue and says, remember, Adam, the law does not change the human heart. It's only the gospel. So we can't fault C.S. Lewis for not doing that in The Abolition of Man. The context was not, and it's not that it was inappropriate, but he would have lost his audience immediately had he put forward a Christian argument. And to be sure, there is room for the natural law tradition. In fact, and this might be cliche, I don't intend for it to be cliche. When Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that famous essay, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he made a very similar point that if our nation's laws, civil positive laws, are not backed up by something higher, ultimately something that God has put into the created order, then all laws are just sort of willy-nilly subject to the whims of the people. And as he kind of famously put, it was, unjust laws are no laws at all. You could have, King doesn't argue this, but you could have a country like National Socialist Germany, where the laws take one shape, or you could have a country like America where the laws take a very different shape, and there's no way to navigate or judge which one's better if there is nothing higher that sets a standard for what is good, true, and beautiful. I think I've gone longer than I'm supposed to go. Bottom line, though, let me reiterate the point. While natural law tradition is part of the Christian tradition, you can't get around it. Romans chapter 2 and elsewhere in Scripture, as you all know from this conference, and sadly, it's weird that we have to do Abolition of Man towards the end because it's like the law. We don't want to end with the law. It is, and I think maybe the thing that might motivate us as we're thinking about education today and the way our culture is going is to, while we might have those days like Francisco where we're running towards like something authoritarian, really the only thing that's going to change a person's heart or a culture's heart is the gospel. All the more to take Lewis's words in The Weight of Glory towards the end that Dan Price talked about. more seriously than before, and I struggle with it day in and day out because there's a lot of people I really dislike. In fact, most people. Is that not only are we immortal, we have this sort of burden, this weight of glory as we're become increasingly aware that everybody around us, including those undesirables, if you will, they too are people for whom Christ has died, because they too have an immortal soul. God has loved them even before the foundations of the world, just like he loves you.